So anyway, the point was I spent a lot of time going, well, we need to just criticize liberalism and come up with some not liberal way of thinking, and then we can kind of make progress. But then when you look at the original liberals, the classical liberals, the question is, why didn't they run into these kinds of problems? So like people who founded the United States, who founded Australia, France after the revolution, these people were liberals, but they weren't hostile to gender norms. They weren't hostile to the Christian faith. They weren't hostile to, they were kind of like ethno-nationalists, very consciously so. Particularly in the Australian and American contexts. How does this all fit together? Why did because people say, well, liberalism implies that you can't have these things. You can't have a kind of like normative, national character, basically. And that's why it's a critique from the right often. But original liberalism did have all of these things. And so I guess what became obvious to me is that they were kind of presupposing basically a kind of national membrane that was kind of definitive in a certain sense. And they kind of deployed liberalism within those parameters. It wasn't like universalized. Basically, citizenship was the kind of kernel of classical liberalism, this idea that once you have citizenship, then here are all these rights and standards within which citizenship gets worked out between citizens. Obviously, Australia's founders in particular, which I've been getting into a lot more recently, they were basically national socialists. Many of them. They had a very strong kind of concept that to be Australian was to be a Christian Aryan. Like the Prime Minister of Australia on his like victory speech in 1904 gives his speech saying that we are a Christian Aryan nation and things like this. But nevertheless, they were liberal. The point is that even if you read like the work of like Kant or work of Rousseau, these different figures, the way that they get interpreted in the 21st century is just simply not how they would have been interpreted in their time. There was a certain kind of presupposition that it almost didn't even need to be theorized, that there were races and ethnicities and gender roles and all of these kinds of normative markers of identity. It was like it was banal to point these things out. They were just obvious. Basically, my point is that what liberalism is basically realizing is something far older than the Enlightenment. What liberalism is basically realizing is, as I said before, citizenship as the kind of like core locus of agency within the political order. And you can kind of trace it back all the way to ancient Athens. Ancient Athens, with Solon's reforms in like 550 BC, there was an intention through kind of breaking up polygamous marriage, cousin marriage, and so forth. There was an intention in breaking up these aristocratic clans. Basically, in ancient Athens, you had a series of basically powerful families, aristocratic families that dominated Athenian politics. And Solon's reforms were intended in breaking up, just redistributing their wealth essentially by forcing them to marry their children out, rather than just having, a clan where all the cousins marry each other and they just like hold their wealth, within this clan structure. Instead, they had to kind of marry their children out. And, in so doing, their wealth becomes dispersed through the community. And, within a century, Socrates shows up and you start having Athenian citizenship becomes a question of inquiring into the civic good as opposed to just pursuing my clan interest. What's natural for humans to do is to form these clans and then basically like jostle to be like the most powerful family in a society. What was radical about ancient Athens was a kind of form of proto-liberalism, was saying like, no, we're going to intentionally displace that because we want to have a kind of body of citizens who don't have enough power to assert themselves over the political order by virtue of their wealth and prestige in society. We want them to actually have to engage in debate and convince the other people within the polis of with good reason, basically of different policies and how the state should operate. Obviously, you have this period of sophistry. Socrates comes along with basically what Socrates does in kind of engaging with ethical questions is Socrates kind of opens up metaphysics by kind of demonstrating that you can't really find ultimate ethical answers without positing a metaphysical notion of the good, that there is some kind of inherent natural good, which we must presuppose to have some kind of ontological reality prior to society that can govern it. I was initially critical of this, but again, I think through more reflection, I've become far more sympathetic to this project, which obviously kind of culminates in the Aristotelian concept of natural law, which becomes a kind of centerpiece of Catholic civilization, fused with Roman law, and this basically is definitive of the modern West. as a civic order, in essence. And then you look at like someone like Thomas Aquinas and various other scholastic theologians in like the 12th century, and they are making arguments for basically representative democracy. They're making arguments for quote unquote liberalism. And I came to realize that liberalism wasn't some fabrication of the 17th century, in response to tyrannical absolutism, but actually, in a sense, that liberalism was a kind of conservative force in a certain sense that was kind of returning to this kind of classical conception of the civic order. That really changed my attitude, because what you see in ancient Athens is a kind of proto-nationalism that essentially, once you start having citizenship, then who do we identify with? We don't identify with the clan anymore. Now we identify with the city of Athens. Now, obviously, Athens is engaging in wars with Sparta and so forth, but then they have to fight the Persians, and then they start to realize that they're Greeks, and this is kind of different than just simply being Athenians. But what really becomes intense is when basically Rome takes over and then the church is established. People realize their identity, they come to identify with Christendom, which in other words, basically they come to form a kind of pan-European identity. When Napoleon gets the Pope to kind of crown him with a wreath in the style of, a Roman emperor, Napoleon, you could see from his memoirs, very clearly was attempting to kind of reestablish this kind of European state, to inherit Rome, essentially, for the modern world. He wasn't simply just some kind of a French nationalist. But basically the point that I'm making, rambling a little bit, is that these higher order identities, these identities of national identities, identifying with Western civilization as such, these things become possible once you have a notion of citizenship and a required fidelity to reason in ethical discourse as the kind of centerpiece of the civic order, as opposed to simply just obeying authorities arbitrarily because they have more wealth and power than you. Like, that basically changed my attitude in a big way, because I kind of initially thought, the problem is Enlightenment reason. The problem is, because that's obviously implicated in liberalism, the problem is we're just having this like society of perpetual discourse, and that discourse can essentially be dominated by certain institutional actors, particularly in the modern world. There is no real free, equal participation in discourse. Instead, it's like, well, do you have a television station? Do you have a social media company? Do you have a university? If you don't have these kinds of things, you're not like on an equal footing. But this was kind of always the case. But it seemed as though in the past we were able to have far more reasonable governing discourse. Like, if you read newspapers from the United States in the 19th century, quite clear that whether you're on the left or the right, you're a far more reasonable person than you are today. And again, like looking into Australian history, I came to this realization also that like guys like me we're like mainstream politicians 100 years ago, writing books about which conspiracies to control global finance and things like this. And then there's a strong tradition in Western states of people that would be part of the dissident right today. Their ideas are basically what people in the dissident right today think, but they were running Western states, right? So it's like, well, how did it get to the situation where basically we were sane and now we're insane?
One question that I did want to pose to Joel, if he's not necessarily considering the Enlightenment as the historical moment in which things sort of jumped the shark and we went from kind of a sane natural order to an insane order. I'm curious if there's a precise moment he might point to. But you were about to say what you considered the primary problem to be. I think maybe you were trying to sort of isolate the historical moment in which things fell apart.
Yeah, so originally, like I said, my original view was that the problem was like this idea, which was Adam Katz's idea, that you have what he called super sovereignties, that no one knows exactly who should be in charge. No one knows who they should obey, appealing to reason. We can keep projecting reason rule, and so therefore we can never really have any kind of stable authority, a kind of like neo-absolutism, if you will, a sense that, well, someone's got to be in charge. This is like a critique of democracy. And I bought that for a time, but now I don't buy it at all. In fact, it's the opposite. I think the whole essence of Western civilization is supposed to be the idea of citizenship, I believe, as a fundamental unit. I think liberalism and nationalism are just two aspects of what citizenship is. And I would say in the modern world, the problem is not so much liberalism, but just that like the nationalist membrane has been removed from liberalism. And so it kind of ends up extending itself into all these paradoxes because it's extending itself beyond a concept of citizenship. But the point is that in order to have a kind of a civic discourse organized around citizenship, you need to say, well, there are certain metaphysical rules or epistemological rules that govern civic discourse. And those, abstract rules are basically what enable us to engage in a form of adversarialism that can ultimately result in a conclusion conclusion. Say, well, but the issue, I think, is that in the 20th century, the social sciences essentially become disconnected from metaphysics. So this happens even in the late 19th century with like the American pragmatists. So you have this kind of age of anti-metaphysical skepticism, which expresses itself in myriad ways, whether you look at like logical positivism on one end of the spectrum, or you've got like Heideggerian thinking on the other, even like a certain reading of Nietzsche, kind of certain postmodern reading of Nietzsche. You have all these different kind of approaches that ultimately undermine the authority of reason. And so once this occurs, you at the same time have this kind of simultaneous explosion of a particularly notorious ethnicity's intellectuals. It just basically spread a whole bunch of nonsense, critical theory, anthropological denials of race, sociological denials that nationalism exists prior to the Industrial Revolution, all different kinds of flavors of a particular tendency that Kevin MacDonald does a more or less decent job of explaining. Why was this possible? It was possible basically because the authority of reason had become displaced in civil discourse. We no longer had people running institutions that basically govern discourse that had any kind of epistemic integrity. And so we have this kind of degradation of social science and political discourse in general. It gets exacerbated by new media forms, kind of sensationalist mass media. And I think this is really the essence of the problem. The problem is not that discourse prevents an authority from forming. The problem is just that the structure of discourse in the West has basically been undermined. It's no longer being reproduced. And so I kind of shifted from a kind of personal concept of authority to an impersonal concept of authority, where originally I thought authority has to solve the problem of liberalism. It's kind of hysterical about totalitarianism and tyranny, and so it's just constantly undermining anyone actually getting the reins of power and running things. Social structures. I came to the understanding that it's actually impossible for any one person to run the state. It's just too complicated. This is simply too much information, and so the only way in which they can kind of preside over such a complex institution is by having impersonal principles that they can kind of identify with and select intermediaries that also have the same kind of identification. I.e., because simply couldn't run a state without ideology. It's just simply too, as I said, it's just too complicated. It's this interdisciplinary, nexus of disciplines that have to kind of train a whole legion of bureaucrats and policy wonks, and that kind of spin out talking points and legislation and so forth, and kind of internalize a certain kind of attitude in the judiciary. I mean, it's just far too complicated to kind of run on personal discretion. And so I think the Juvenalian critique of absolutism was basically that in order for the absolute monarch to kind of liberate himself from the aristocracy, he had to create a bureaucracy, basically. He had to create a kind of administrative bureaucracy he could replace them with. But eventually that administrative bureaucracy realizes it doesn't need the absolute monarch. It can kind of just generate its own leadership from, it's entirely, it doesn't need the monarch, but the monarch needs. And eventually this becomes realized and the monarch gets displaced, whether in a brutal sense, like in the French Revolution, or in a kind of a far more gradual sense, like with the British monarchy. Either way, personal authority kind of collapses. So that whole neo-absolutist train of thought, I think it was a dead end. And so now I kind of have what I view as a kind of an attempt at trying to classically define citizenship and bring that and all of its kind of context to basically the contemporary situation and persecute the contemporary situation on its behalf. I find that to be a far more viable path forward, which is the idea that basically Western civilization got it right until it started getting it wrong. And it wasn't as though the solution that we came up with in kind of combining liberalism and nationalism was somehow inherently flawed. It was just simply that its essential principles became undermined and eroded. So I guess the view that I've come around to, you could kind of describe in a certain way as kind of a kind of conservatism, but it's a kind of conservatism that I don't really think anyone else really kind of defends when they defend conservatism. It's kind of like a deep conservatism, which at the same time is a form of progressivism, because essentially it basically undermines a lot of reactionary perspective that views history as to have a positive view essentially of the Enlightenment in toto, to engage creatively with these questions. And sometimes engaging creatively with questions, you kind of criticize established ideas or trends, and sometimes your logic behind